All right, thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz live Monday through Friday, noon to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Welcome to the program. And this afternoon, I'm joined by Joshua Mitchell. He's a professor of political theory at Georgetown University. He's the author of numerous journal articles and 4 books, most recently, Tocqueville in Arabia. Professor Mitchell's research focuses on Western political philosophy and theology. Uh, Joshua, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
My pleasure, Charles. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Listen, the book is American Awakening, Identity, Politics, and Other Afflictions of Our Time. What a timely book, especially in these times where you break down some of the cultural phenomena that we're dealing with right now, what I would call a soft tyranny, actually. And, you talk about what I think the interesting phrase you use here in your introduction is cultural eugenics. So let's start there. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's a provocative phrase to be sure, but I think it's right. Uh, I'm old enough to remember a time and an aspiration to have in America something we called liberal politics, which was a lot of give and take, a lot of push and pull, but we were interested really in building a world together. I grew up, of course, during the space program, and so there was an aspiration to really build a world. My concern with identity politics is it's really not about that. Identity politics is really concerned with establishing a kind of spiritual eugenics. And I call it a spiritual eugenics because the concern there is really guilt and innocence, which are theological categories.
Mm-hmm.
And what has happened with identity politics is that we've established a kind of, well, you know this, an intersectionality score.
Mm-hmm.
And depending upon the level of victimhood you have, you get more and more points, and the people who are the victimizers get no points and are silenced. And this is not the way to build a polity.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about spiritual eugenics because I think it should be noted that the whole literal so-called pseudo-scientific eugenic movement, at least before World War II, was largely an endeavor of the left, and it was sort of a liberal establishment thing. And the main opponents to it actually were Christians and conservatives. And that the idea was that, there were superior races, basically, what it comes down to, and that weaker people should be quarantined, isolated, marginalized, and that the superior races would essentially, load over them for their own good.
It sounds quite familiar, as you know. I talk a great deal about Christianity here, and I do it in the following way. I say that the first instance of the idea of the scapegoat occurs in Leviticus. It's chapter 16. But for the Christians, the formulation is that Christ is the divine scapegoat who takes away the sins of the world. And my argument is once that happens, once you make that kind of an argument, you can't do what has happened throughout pagan history, which is if there is some impurity to be purged, you identify a group out there, usually another nation, and you wage war and salt the earth and completely expunge them. And my argument is that Christianity changed that equation and said the stain that you're looking to get rid of is so deep, this is original sin, that you can't atone for it simply by purging another group. And so Christ is the divine scapegoat who takes away the sins of the world. My argument is that identity politics is sufficiently like Christianity precisely because it uses and is fixated on the categories of transgression and stain. But unlike Christianity, it seeks a mortal scapegoat. And for the moment, the mortal scapegoat is the white heterosexual male. And of course, you should make no mistake about it. I have no interest in defending this or that identity group. But the internal logic of identity politics requires that once that group is purged, you're going to have to turn to other groups. And you've probably seen the Karen meme. Mm-hmm. One could argue that this is beginning to happen with white women. And then, of course, the great irony of all this, but I believe that the next group will be Black heterosexual men who believe in the family and who believe in the church. So a civil rights movement, which begins, or rather the concern for victimhood that begins in America at any rate, with the civil rights movement then extends in the views of the left, first to women's rights, then to gay rights, then to transgender rights. So you get to the point now where with transgender claims, to be heteronormative and to believe in a conventional church makes you guilty of a thought crime. And this can't be the full outcome of the civil rights movement, which is why I'm really waiting for Black Americans to wake up and say, this is not really what we signed up for.
I think that it's gradually happening. And as you point out, they need a villain to focus their energy on as some external foci of their own internal rage and maybe even their own internal guilt, or even it almost comes down to something personal. I mean, we could look at a lot of the psychological elements that make up this particular mindset. But I think you're quite right that the enemy, that the left always needs an enemy, and the progressive movement, in a sense, even to exist, they almost need this focus outside of themselves. And in recent years, that enemy has been none other than Donald Trump, right? I mean, that's the orange man. I mean, everything, even to the point of their own personal life and their own personal problems, was all because of Trump. He was to blame for everything.
One of the things
yeah.
Go ahead, please. No, go ahead.
No, please.
One of the things I noticed as Trump kind of stepped into the public light was that if you were in polite company, you had to say something about how despicable Donald Trump was. And I think part of the problem here is that identity politics has so taken hold that lots of white people, and I hate to use that phrase because my view is we need to go back to national origin, which tells a lot more about us than blanket things like white. But let's just carry this on for a minute. What became really fascinating to me was in white company, as it were, it really became necessary to distance yourself from him, to say all sorts of horrible things about him. The left needed him to be racist. I never believed he was.
Of course not.
I think he was tone deaf, and so a lot of things that he said could be read that way. But I think that's quite silly. But the larger issue here is what I talk about in the preface, namely, there's a Passover ritual that has to occur if you are one of the transgressor groups. So if you are white, especially if you're a white man, you have to demonstrate on a daily basis that you are on the side of the innocents. And of course, in the original Passover, the Jews had to paint the blood of an innocent lamb on the lintel of the door so that death would pass over. And my argument is that every day in America, whites who want social death to pass over have to call out some transgressor group, have to demonstrate that they are innocent. And so I think woke capitalism can be understood within this rubric. I'm all for using the best science to figure out what sort of world we live in and what we need to do. And I do believe we need to live much more modest lives. But it seems to me that climate change is really about more than that. The fact that we use words like clean energy and dirty fossil fuels tells me that there's something more, that people seem to be more interested than the stain and impurity aspects of this than the actual science. That's why I say we're in the midst of a great awakening without God and without forgiveness. In the 1760 and 1820s American Great Awakening, the concern was purity and stain. Am I impure? How do I become pure again? And that's what a religious revival is. And my argument is we have that happening exactly right now in America. Everybody is desperately searching for some cover of innocence, some fig leaf, if you want to use the Genesis account. And that this will end very badly because you can't build a world when the only thing you're concerned with is innocence and transgression.
Well, you're talking about, and you use the language of religion, but it's religion without God. It's religion as such, and I would even say this to atheists, without some sort of an external foci of truth, of existence, of reality that cannot be manipulated by people. Because we all agree that we're imperfect. We're not gods. The Bible the book of Genesis says we're created in the image of God. We're not God. And that's to
Yeah.
say, to try to pretend you're like God is the ultimate blasphemy. That's idol worship. So,
Yeah.
they basically, by replacing God, replace God with themselves as the arbiters, as the elite that seeks to be enlightened, and they feel justified to control others for their own good, even if that means having a Holocaust every so often. It's
Yeah.
all for the improvement of the race. I think a lot of this goes into scientization of biology by Darwin, and the idea that you need to preserve and advance a superior race, or what Darwin called a species. And that it brings us again to the idea of eugenics. And just I want to again touch on the metaphor of Trump, because he represented something that was a block to this view of reinventing man, of recreating a new type of human being, of a eugenic program, in that he stood for the individual, at least in their minds. And he was kind of an alpha male, if you will, a bit of a not someone that could be controlled very easily. He was an independent billionaire. He didn't really answer to anyone. And I think that was fearful to them in this scientific experiment with humanity, where everything becomes sort of controlled, and everything becomes managed. And you talk about, the focus, this intense focus on race, as something where I think that when you scratch the surface on the left with identity politics, they actually believe that people are literally different because of their race. They don't believe that we're all basically the same, and that we all, have differences individually. They actually view people as having a different thought. And I think this also gets into some of the university identity studies disciplines, whether it be feminist studies or gender studies or whatever, that they actually believe that people are literally different, that they are, they are at different levels, maybe, of evolution. I don't know.
Yeah. So let me respond to two things that you've said here. The left has a clear view of what the arc of history aims toward, and it's not Donald Trump. I mean, he's literally a person that cannot exist in their world. He is, as you say, an alpha male. He's not ashamed of being whoever he is. He pushes back against identity politics. He literally can't exist, which is why a kind of deus ex machina had to be invented to explain his victory, which was, of course, the Russia collusion, because it can't be by mortal means that he won. There had to be some demonic force involved, which caused him to win. And this continues to pervade on the left as well. With respect to race, it's actually very troubling what's developed. It's the new racism, which goes under the guise of beneficence, but it's the new racism. So you might have heard that the San Diego school system has decided that because Blacks actually can't compete with the other groups that are there, they're not going to insist that they grade in the same way. This is the new essentialism. It's basically giving Blacks a pass. And I work with Bob Woodson, who you may have heard of. He runs
Yes, I have.
Woodson Center.
Mm-hmm.
And Bob and I have worked together for a couple of years. And Bob and this group that we've all formed called 1776, which was a pushback against the New York Times 1619 project. He's incensed by this. And everybody who's on the call, both Black and white, is just incensed by this, because it in effect says that Blacks are inferior. They can't compete. This is, as I said, the new essentialism. And this is not what America is built on. We have had a rough time of it. Slavery is still kind of, the legacy of slavery is still off in the shadows. My view on that matter is that we don't have collective guilt, but we do have collective responsibility to help the least among us. And if Blacks are in inner cities are disproportionately affected, well, we have to help them because they are least among us. But that's because of collective responsibility, not collective guilt. But there's no way that you can help people if you presume that they're actually incapable of rising to the level of excellence. If I can just tell a quick anecdote. I was in Iraq for 2 years. I left Georgetown and went to run the American University of Iraq in Sulaymaniyah.
Mm-hmm.
That's in Kurdistan. We had Arab students, we had Kurdish students, but we had a particular category of students called the Anfal students. And if you recall, Saddam Hussein practiced genocide against the Kurds and gassed in Halabja tens of thousands of people. So we had a category of students, which were basically students whose parents were gassed to death. So these people had been through hell. So what was very interesting to watch was the division that immediately appeared in the American faculty. One group, and I count myself among this group, said, yeah, they have been through hell, all right. So the best thing we can do for them is to teach them what standards of excellence are, hold them accountable to it so that they will succeed. And then there were the guilty teachers who said, look at what we did in Iraq. Look at these poor students. They're incapable of doing their work. We can let them cheat. Their homework doesn't have to be handed in on time. We'll fudge on the grades. And this is how we help them. Of course, some of the students immediately fell for that. And the other students who had gone through hell but understood that that was no good, they sided with us. There was really a kind of internal war. And what was most interesting about it, now I come to white guilt, is that these students, the teachers, the meaning of their existence was tied up in helping these students. And I began to wonder what would happen if these students, and we can now extrapolate and say what would happen to all the millions of people who are on receivership, government receivership, so to speak, who depend on all these do-good programs. What would happen if these students in Iraq, and if Blacks on welfare or other assistance programs came to those officers and said, you know what, we don't need your help. We can do this and we want to do this on our own. Well, suddenly the meaning of their lives would be completely lost because they need this dependency that this group has. This is the pathology that we have in America today. We of course we need to help, and charity is a big part of this. I do not wish to sound mean-spirited. When people are hurting, you do everything you can to help them, but you don't wrap your own meaning up in the meaning of your existence up in their being dependent upon you. And we have now a government that requires a permanent class, an underclass in America. And the way we justify this, and you just said it, is we say, well, these people really aren't capable of taking care of themselves. This is the new racism in America.
Yeah, I mean, brilliant, amazing insight. Look, this is it's kind of the equivalent of the old patronizing white man's burden, Rudyard Kipling,
Yes.
version of British imperial racism. You're a better man than I, Gunga Din. I mean, it's sort of like looking at. They talk to Black people in this country like they're children. I mean, they're like the great administrator, and in a sense, it's both gives them a sense of empowerment because they feel that they are literally superior, even though that's not something that's necessarily conscious of, and that they have this kind of divine, almost divine right, a divine right without the divine, to control Black people and manipulate them and essentially experiment on them as a subset in the culture. And it justifies, as you say, giving people a pass. I mean, I think a good example of that, and they use it for their own benefit. And I'll give you an example. This idea that somehow Black men and women cannot identify themselves as in order to vote. That the idea of having a voter ID, a simple voter ID made available for free and made available in an organized way, that this is somehow against Black people. I mean, it is patronizing, it's insulting, it's offensive, and it's really just they're being used as an excuse for people who want to continue to cheat and steal elections. It's all like kind of, they're like just the straw people to fulfill this agenda.
I think that's right. Nothing is more insidious than power that masquerades itself as justice. And of course, in America, we do have the racial wound, and there is profound guilt about it, and not a clear view about what to do. We could talk about Bob Woodson if you want, because I think at some point, because Bob gets this. But the way people are dealing with this is not constructive. So, for example, in the small town where I live, and I'm not going to mention the name, which is largely, I would say it's a town of 5,000, but it's a college town with a fair amount of upper middle class retirees who have come from elsewhere. And down the middle of the street is a Black Lives Matter painted sign. And I think to myself, what do they think they really gain by this? They haven't done anything. They haven't really, really helped, but there's a lot of moral posturing that's involved here. And so you go to sleep at night, or they go to sleep at night, thinking they've done the right thing by supporting the right cause. And meanwhile, Black Lives Matter turns out to be not such a friendly group. We really don't know where the money is going.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be clear, I spend a lot of my time working with Bob Woodson, trying to figure out how we can constructively deal with the race issue. So it's not as if I wish to be colorblind and pretend this is not an issue. But nobody knows where the money goes. Black Lives Matter has basically strong-armed all sorts of corporations, extracted money from them, and in effect give them the moral path so they can continue to exploit. We've got a real class problem in America, not a race problem in America. They continue to grow richer and richer and richer, but it's okay so long as they support Black Lives Matter or climate change. I mean, this is really rather extraordinary. The new elites cover their class privilege with the social justice fig leaf. That's really what's driving this. And in a funny way, although I right of center, in a funny way, Bernie Sanders got it more right than the identity politics crowd on the left. It's not to say I support Bernie Sanders's claims, but the class problem is the problem we have to deal with. And by that I mean simply this: I don't wish to use Marxist analysis for it, but we have a growing wealth divide in this country. And I think what Trump understood, even if he was unable to implement it for all sorts of complicated reasons, what he did understood was that, to paraphrase Bill Clinton of many, many years ago, it's about the middle class stupid. Mm-hmm. We really have to rebuild the middle class. And that means bringing manufacturing home. But instead of focusing on that, we give the global elites a pass so long as they identify with social justice causes.
Very well put. I know I live in the city of Boston, and I live near a sort of a well-to-do, liberal, predominantly white suburb where you see the same Black Lives Matter signs, and people feel that by simply proclaiming this slogan, which is something we all agree with, they're going to be doing something. It's kind of like, I don't know, front groups in the 1930s calling themselves, peace, love, applehood, and mother pie, motherhood and apple pie, right. When in fact they were communist fronts. It's these are slogans that are things that everybody agrees with, but it puts you on the spot, because if you don't agree, with this particular organization, which is not what it says it is, then somehow you're against Black people. I mean, it's a classic piece of propaganda and of ledgered main.
Let me add, can I add one more thing about this? So Marxism never really took hold in America, and it couldn't. And Louis Hartz was the famous diagnostician of this in the 1950s. In 1955, he wrote a book called The Liberal Tradition in America. His argument was Marxism will never take hold here. That project left will never take hold here in America, because Americans basically believe in individual rights and property. So it doesn't comport with our cultural categories. Identity politics is far more pernicious. Why? Because it does comport with our cultural category, because our cultural category is guilt. It comes from being a nation steeped in the Bible. And so guilt is always already there in the American psyche. And so the left could not succeed in undermining the family, the church, all our civic institutions in the Constitution through Marxism. But it will, unless we're really, really careful. It will do it through guilt, and more precisely racial guilt. And in Europe, the way this is happening, it's not so much racial guilt, although colonialism is there. It's national guilt about World War I, World War II, and of course the Holocaust. And the bargain that's being made over there right now on the left, by the left, to everybody else is, look, I'll speak as a leftist. Look at what your nations have done. You have so much guilt. There's no, and here's the most important point, there's no way to absolve this guilt except for you to renounce your nations. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're living in Eastern Europe, and in Hungary and Poland, where they know that guilt is something to be wrestled with in the churches, they have an antidote to this, because they say, yes, there is a way for us to deal with guilt. It's called forgiveness, atonement, repentance, etc. And that's how we can build a world. But in Western Europe, where they have no church whatsoever, they've retained the Christian guilt. This is the most important thing. They retain the guilt but not the architecture that they can use to absolve themselves of it. And so the left steps in and say, well, here's the way you're going to get rid of your guilt. You're going to renounce your nation. And that's what's happening. And the right is pushing back against this, sometimes constructively, sometimes not. But this is the left's leverage. There's so much guilt, and there's no way to deal with it in Western Europe.
Well, they've retained the idea of Christian guilt, except it's without Christ.
Yes.
And if you look at the way the Communist Manifesto works, Marx says in one of the planks that you have to, in order to create socialism in a targeted society, you have to find their weaknesses, their points of vulnerability, and divide those, exploit that, work with that, create a new dialectic. And originally the Marxist dialectic was class. That's what's pushed by Bernie Sanders. I think in the 1950s, you had the Marxist theoretician Franz Fanon, who was the author of The Wretched of the Earth.
Yes.
And he's the one that came up with the emphasis on race and maybe on regionalism as a way to divide people and to divide the world. And the United States would be particularly targeted because that is our vulnerability. We do have a history of racism. We have a history of white supremacy because we're multiracial, and the white race, as it were, happens to be and happened to have been the dominant race, as opposed to maybe a European country where everybody's white. So, this has been the target, to create, to sow division and to create identity on both sides. People who never thought of themselves as being white, all of a sudden are now classified as white, and vice versa. People are put into, the whole category of Hispanic or Latino was something that was sort of crafted in the 1970s. And that includes, this whole thing is a social construct. And it's one that is emphasized as a way of creating this dialectic of exploitation, that somehow if someone is not put in the category of white, they are automatically to be viewed as not only being exploited in the same way that Marx viewed the proletariat as exploited, but that therefore they have to rise up and they have to get something that is owed them because of that, regardless of anything that they may have done personally.
Yeah. So you've raised a number of issues. Let me just take them in a way in reverse order. So I don't know if you know of Michael Gonzalez, who works at the Heritage Foundation. He's of Cuban descent, but he has done a full-fledged study of how the category Hispanic was invented. And of course, he's incensed by this because I'm not a Hispanic, I'm a Cuban. And that's what I was trying to say at the beginning. I think one of the things we all have to do as responsible Americans is push back on the racial label. Part of my family came from Lebanon. Part of my family came from Wales, Germany, and Holland. White, it just means absolutely nothing to me. So I think we really do need to challenge these established categories. And the way we do this, by the way, is when we fill out the forms. I refuse to sign to make the X in white, although technically that's my designation. Quick side note: if Obama had succeeded in establishing a new protected category, which was people of Northeast and Middle Eastern, North African descent, I can't remember the acronym for it, I would in fact be a protected category. And I could sue Georgetown for hostile work environment. And I could say, not because I'm conservative, but because, by God, I'm from the Middle East, and there's a prejudice here. So this, where this ends is not clear. On the matter of being white, I said at the outset, I believe in a liberal politics. And by that, I do not mean left of center. I mean a liberal politics based on interests, based on building a world together in good faith. That's, in my view, what liberalism is supposed to be. And of course, now we have only liberal that equals left, and then there's those conservatives. My view is we really need to have three and not two. Well, that's three categories, not two. That's another issue. But what I tell my friends on the left is, listen, you've got millions of Americans who would rather not think in racial terms. But if you keep pressing them and saying you're white, or I'm a person of color, or opposed to white, then what you're saying is the only way that you are allowed to speak is if you claim your racial identity. That is a really, really dangerous game here. But that's the game the left is playing, is really to try to racialize everything. My view is that we look, let us start from the fact that we have groups. I'm not opposed to groups. My father's family came from Lebanon. There are still groups of my cousins who speaking 1890 Lebanese/Syrian border mountain dialect in Worcester, Massachusetts, right down the road from you.
Yeah.
I have no objection to no objection. This is the way human beings start out. They start out in groups. The wonderful thing about America is not we completely erase those things. I would hope we never do, but that we can rise up just enough above those, what I call just enough liberalism, so that we can recognize each other as citizens, as persons, etc. We can't pretend that race and ethnicity and all these national markers don't exist. That's what makes the world wonderful and complicated. But to try to essentialize them, and this comes back to a point that you had made earlier, and to say these are the only things that count. When you do that and say white is the only thing that counts, and people being a person of color is the only thing that counts, you can't be citizens then. And there's a certain perverse irony in all this, because it's elites who want us to think this way. And of course, they have no citizenship whatsoever. My counter to this is take a look around, people. That person who you hate because of their race, their color, whatever it happens to be, they are your fellow citizens. And you need to stop pretending that you can hover above and get rid of the national mix that we have. And let's just do what we can. We can keep our communities, but as a political matter, we have to put all that stuff down. One more thing. You mentioned guilt without Christ, and this raises somebody we haven't spoken about who turns out to be really, really important. I mean, Nietzsche's the founder of the postmodern movement, but he wrote, for your audience, he wrote 1870s to 85 or so, and then he did go insane. We should be very clear. He did go insane and rocked in a rocking chair on his sister's front porch for the last 10 years of his life and said nothing. But while he did go insane, he had this most remarkable of insights. He predicted the future of Europe, and he said, look, this is what's going to happen. And his pithy phrase that captured it is to be found in one of his essays called In the Genealogy of Morals. He's talking to enlightened Europeans. He says, it is the church and not its poison that offends us. And what he meant by that was that Europe had thought it had become so enlightened, whether it's socialism or whatever it happens to be, and it didn't need religion. In fact, looked down on religion. But he said Europe still carried all the trappings of religion. So the belief in equality, the belief in the dignity of persons, and let us add the categories of purity and stain. And what he predicted would happen in about 1880 has absolutely come to pass 140 years later. Namely, that you've got these so-called enlightened people on the left who hate Christianity, and yet they're really still dependent upon the fundamental Christian terms, like notions of equality, etc. And above all, let me add the most important one, the status or the category of the innocent victim, of whom Christ is the paradigmatic example of the innocent victim. And so Nietzsche thought that Europe and the West would be consumed for centuries with by this intermediate position where they couldn't move beyond Christian categories of innocence and guilt. But as you say, there was no way to solve the problem through the churches because they had left the churches behind. This is the sickness that we're living through right now. And the scary thing is that I think we actually need to either go back to putting guilt and innocence in their full biblical framework, which is to say there must be a kind of renewal of the churches and the synagogues. We have to have that. Or if we don't, what you're going to do is you're going to see a doubling down on these claims about transgression and people against whites, and it'll be against women, it'll be against black heterosexual males. There will be no end to the people who get canceled. And there's no way of atoning for this. And the scary thing about Nietzsche, and here I am not endorsing him, I'm actually frightened by him. What he wanted to happen was for the West to finally fully let go of all the Christian artifacts, namely equality, idea of innocence and guilt. And in fact, he wanted to replace those categories with two categories, strength and weakness. And the way we're back to your eugenics claim, right at the outset. Right. And the thing that worries me so much is a development I'm seeing happen in Holland and a few other places in Europe, and I think in America too, though I can't really tell the numbers. It's hard to say because the news reports, I think, are too inflammatory. But a group of people have begun to rise up and say, it cannot be the case that I am born into a world and I am to bear the weight of irredeemable stain forever. And so what Nietzsche wanted was that we would throw off the very categories of innocence and transgression and return to strength and weakness. And in one very, very famous passage, he asks, how can we have a tomorrow? And he says, in the biblical world, the way you have a tomorrow is through atonement and repentance and forgiveness. And that's how you have a tomorrow. But he says, in the world that I imagine, we have a tomorrow by forgetting. Meaning, if you're European and you're tired of the weight of guilt on your shoulders, you say, yes, there was colonialism. Yes, there was World War I and World War II. Yes, there was the Holocaust. And then you say, but I don't care. I'm going to let that go. I'm going to forget. And that's what most worries me, is that when the weight of stain becomes so grave that there's nothing to lift it from your shoulders, then you start entertaining the true alt-right schemes, which are, we're done with the categories of innocence. We simply want to return to strength and weakness, and we are stronger than you. And that's where we're going, unless we can get the churches and the synagogues of America to reconsider what the wellspring of transgression and innocence are. And it's the biblical language, it's the Bible. And if the churches are unable to renew America and bringing people home and being able to say, and are able to say to them, this is the true place where you will understand innocence and transgression, then we will move in this Nietzschean alt-right direction. It's inevitable.
Yeah, incredible. Great insight. I mean, this is really amazing stuff to think about. And, I guess that, George Washington, I think, laid out an American political philosophy in his farewell address when he talked about the idea that he understood that people had different religions, different, as he said, manners and customs, and that he understood that we're going to relate to those things in our own way. But his hope is that we will put the heart of our nation first, and that we would put our Americanism, in the forefront, while at the same time freely associating or not associating with whatever mannerism, as he called it, we may embrace. And that's kind of the American ethos, besides the idea that rights come from a creator and not from the state. And as such, we recognize that every individual is sovereign, every individual is created in the image of God, and that every life is precious, and that we kind of take it from there. But the collectivist idea of the left, which is really what we're talking about, and I think Nietzsche talked about that with the idea of will, and kind of the collective strength of a nation. And then you had I think people, I think it was Hegel who talked about the nation state as actually having its own organic life itself that could be worshipped, as opposed to the individual under God, which is the American idea. These things are becoming more predominant. As far as the present issue of identity politics, I wonder if some of this isn't also motivated by because ultimately the truth comes out. And I think that the left establishment today, in their focus on identity politics, in a way, they're covering up their own guilt for leftist policies that have harmed Black people and the Black community, starting pretty much in the 1960s. The nationalization of welfare programs, as opposed to handling matters of welfare on a local level where people could actually be helped, and as a charity. The denouncement of the Black church, which was one of the great moral forces in this country, and which I think transformed the white church in many ways, by people like Margaret Sanger, who corrupted Black ministers as a way to get abortion clinics in Harlem, the Negro Project. The destruction of Black business, the destruction of the Black family, the destruction of Black education with their modalities that taught, behaviorism in these big, rotten inner city schools, and across the board, the end of the father in the household. The Black family was intact before welfare. This is something that Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote about. He was Johnson's Assistant Secretary of Labor. He warned about this. And so all they have left, and in spite of this, Black people have risen up, and they've become middle class and upper class. But there's still this permanent underclass that they've created. And with we could say the introduction of drugs and the introduction of crime and all these other things that I think have a certain level of contrivance to them. And then all that's left at the end of the day, the one final arbiter to keep the peace and to help people are the police. And now they're under assault.
Yeah.
They're being told that they're going to be taken out of cities where people are trying to get to work and the children are trying to play out on the stoop. And we're told that they have to be defunded, that they're racist. I think that the whole question of racism in this country has receded a lot. We've come a long way, actually, in spite of these left-wing programs. And maybe this idea of identity politics now, as it's being taught, and as it has replaced the 1776 project that you've talked about. And this it was basically something that was created by this Harvard professor named Charles Pierce in the 1980s. This micromanaging, where you put someone under a microscope to find a racist gene, and you notice
Yeah.
they only do it to people that don't kowtow to the left either. And
Yeah.
this might be a symptom of actually the success of the American culture, that we have moved away from racism to such a high degree that now they have to pull out a microscope to find the racist.
So I don't know how old you are. I'll tell you how old I am. I'm 66, and I remember very clearly in the 60s the movement in society, and Shelby Steele chronicles this really well. After the 1960s, it really was publicly unacceptable to be a racist.
Yes.
I mean, maybe in 1960 it was. After the 1960s, it was simply unacceptable. And to your point, this attests to the profound resilience of our regime. And when people say, well, there's all sorts of racism in America, my answer to the question is, okay, so tell me, if there's problems, tell me what can't be solved by the Constitution we have and by the rule of law. I mean, are you telling me that we have to throw the whole system off? So that's, I think, the question we have to ask. If there are problems, fine. That's the greatness of our system, is it is incredibly responsive when you've got people of goodwill. And even people, you don't have people of goodwill, it's still incredibly responsive to injustices, which is why I want to defend it. But the 1960s, as you said, was also a turning to a darker threat. I mean, so on the one hand, it became publicly unacceptable, but the 1960s also began, I would characterize it as the despondency of Black America. Bob Woodson and I just wrote a piece which was published in the Wall Street Journal on Martin Luther King Day, called "How the Left Betrayed Martin Luther King." And our argument was that, if you look at the history of Black thought in America, all the way up to the 1960s, you had huge disagreements about what was to be done. But what they shared in common was the idea that human beings had agency. And Blacks, yes, they had incredible obstacles, but they believed in their capacity to do something about it. Booker T. Washington thought it was important to stay. W.E.B. Du Bois voiced all sorts of opposition, did finally leave. And then there were others who did actually leave. They didn't just voice opposition, they went back to Africa. So these three strains of thought, which were entirely different, shared in common the idea that there was human agency. When you get with the 1619 Project, the claim, which now resonates up and down the hallways of academia and all the news media every single day of the year, the claim that America is systemically racist, we have to ask the question, okay, so what's the net effect of this claim? What is the import? What's the upshot of this claim? And the upshot of the claim, whenever you make a systemic claim, you're saying, let's be clear on this, it means you can't help yourself. You and your family can't help yourself. Mm-hmm. You and your friends can't help yourself. Your churches are worthless. Your local communities can do nothing. The only thing that can help you is the state. More and more state programs, because it turns out Blacks, and turns out everybody, we're just helpless in a world, and we need more and more global managers. So that's been the big turn. And as you quite rightly point out, it had everything to do with the Great Society program, which may have started out at the right foot. I don't know how many seconds later it turned on the wrong foot, but it quickly became a mechanism through which the state could grow stronger, through which clients and people who were dependent and a professional class would cater to a Black America. But most importantly, it needed a permanent Black underclass to justify its own existence. And that's the really sick moment we're in right now.
Mhm.
Trillions of dollars later, we now have what we never had before. Even in Jim Crow, you didn't have a permanent dependent class of Black Americans. And we should know this from our dealings with Indians. There are only two groups who have ever been in permanent dependence in the United States. It's the American Indians, who are not doing well, and that fragment of Black America that is still dependent, who don't live through their vibrant civic institutions, but live through the mechanisms of the state. This is really twisted, and it has to be undone.
And they're taught resentment, and they're taught division, and they're not, the idea that in a sense, participating in the American system and becoming successful is almost seen as racist. And I've heard rhetoric like that. And you make reference to the 1619 Project, which I think was partially inspired by the really poisonous work of the late Professor Howard Zinn, who years ago I actually had the opportunity to interview. And his book, The People's History of the United States, where they basically say that the United States was founded on the day that the first slave was brought to America, and that the American Revolution was all about preserving slavery. I mean, it's a completely insidious and negative view, an anti-American view. But the problem I have, and you mentioned earlier, and I think accurately, that Americans have never embraced Marxism. We've never embraced socialism. Only a small minority. I don't think it's ever been more than at most 20% of the population. And yet I think that now you see more people on the younger side embracing this as a matter of faith without even necessarily being conscious of it. I don't know if it's because of our education system. You're a college professor, so you've had a first front porch look at the college student over time. What is going on with our, the boom, the millennials, the younger people, and their belief in such doctrines as, everyone's a white supremacist and, racial oppression and all of that?
Well, so a lot of things are going on. You formulated it quite well. For one, this is a generation that's been raised on glass screens and their thumbs. Mm-hmm. And what this means is they, for lots of complicated reasons, many of them don't have real hands-on experience with the limits of life. And so the task of life is not building something together. It's a kind of social justice posturing. The term social justice, it's been around for a while, but what I've noticed in the last 15, 20 years is that all of my students at Georgetown, and it's not just Georgetown, it's everywhere, use the term, and I ask them to tell me what it is, and they really don't know. So that's part of the problem. I want to alert you to a paradox here that we really need to diagnose. Mm-hmm. So if you go to a high school graduation or college graduation, you'll have purportedly the smartest kid in the class getting up there and saying some version of the same old speech, which is, we're going to take control of the world, we're going to change it, we have all these great ideas, we're in command. Now, set against that is how students responded to the COVID lockdown. Now, you and I were in the 60s, I think a little older than you. Mm-hmm. But if somebody gave us an order in the 60s, we didn't really obey it generally. Right. There was all sorts of student protests. What has been so remarkable is that these students who are, in command of the universe are going to change the world without a peep across the country, college students just obeyed orders. And here's the paradox. How is it that you can make claims about radical freedom, claiming that you're radically free to transform the world, and then the next moment fall back into utter obedience? And Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, toward the end, where he gets deeply pessimistic about America. Remember, he writes this in 1835, 1840, thereabouts. Mm-hmm. He has this remarkable statement. He says, I foresee a day when the Americans will think of themselves as greater than kings and less than men. Not or, and less than men. And he's really describing bipolarity, manic depression, where you feel nothing can stop you and then you feel utterly impotent. Now we've medicalized that treatment long before there were drugs. Tocqueville saw this as a consequence of what's going to happen in the democratic age. And what he meant by that, or what he thought was going to happen, was that the links that would hold us generation to generation, person to person, these would break down and we would become more and more isolated and alone. And in our psychic condition then a psychic condition would emerge that coincided with this experience of complete isolation. So because we're isolated and nobody can tell us no, we become sovereign selves. I call this selfie man. So around the world, we have millions and millions of people who daily take selfies of themselves. This is a philosophical phenomenon. We have to figure out what this means. What does it mean that the world is the backdrop to you? You must be really, really important if you take selfies. And yet, when there's any challenge that has to be met, this generation cowers and hands it over to what I call the global managers. So we have this strange configurations. I think it's really, really emerged after 1989 of what I call management society and selfie man. So on the one hand, you're utterly impotent, and so you have to hand everything up to the global managers. On the other hand, you're the most powerful thing in the world, and you post on Facebook. So Facebook is part of the pathology here. And so when Donald Trump pulled out of the climate accords, what was perfectly predictable happened. Namely, young people gnashing their teeth and pulling out their hair said, this is the end of the world. The implication is that if we have a problem to solve, the only way we can do this is through global management of the entire thing. And my view is, and I do this in my own life, I mean, I'm working with alternative technologies for solar boat sailing or solar sailboating. My view is, if we have a problem, then each nation should come up with its plans, just as, if we've got a COVID crisis, federalism matters. Different states have different histories and different sets of relations of institutions, and you need to hand it down to the lowest level you possibly can to solve this problem. But that's not how this younger generation feels. Solving things together, well, that's what I call liberal politics of competence. They don't want to do that because they have just been using their thumbs in glass for most of their life, and the idea of actually working with your neighbor, it's too much for them. So they see this individualist thing of people having to work together, and they think, well, that, I don't want to do that. So the alternative, they think, is a kind of global socialism where you've got free college and where we spend $50 trillion that we don't have on the new green energy deal because the spiritual economy of cleanliness is way more important to them than how much things actually cost in dollars and cents. So you've got a completely disjointed younger generation, and COVID has only made this worse. Yes. Because I see my students now. I've been doing this online for 7 or 8 months. I've seen them gain weight. I've gotten notes about depression and suicidal thoughts as I've never had before.
Oh, yeah.
And I wrote about this immediately after it happened. I said, there's many ways to die, and COVID-19 is one of them. But social distancing produces a world exactly as Tocqueville predicted. In fact, his phrase for delinking could be social distancing, where we don't look at each other, we don't care for each other, we order things online, we look to the state to take care of ourselves, and we post our selfie self pictures on Facebook. This is exactly the pathology that leads to the kinder and gentler tyranny at the end of history. So I'm saying we may have saved ourselves medically, but we're killing ourselves politically. That's the problem here. And of course, now we're raising this huge question about the fear of death. And of course, if you have no religious background, the thing you're going to do most of all is fear death. And all sorts of people throughout history have understood that if you have citizens who are fearful of death, it's over. There's no way your country's going to be able to defend itself or make hard choices or make hard sacrifices. It's just not going to happen. So that's where we are too. And you've got this. You just go on for one more minute. You've got this digital elite that dreams that because they live in this digital world where they can order things on Amazon, they can put on their face masks and keep the analog disease called COVID-19 out of their world. Of course, they count on the poor people to deliver their groceries to them and things like that. But there's an analog digital divide here, and some people can live on the other half of it and can dream, the digital ones, can dream like Bill Gates and the others that, well, it's okay, we're going to live this way forever. we're going to just keep the poisons on the other side of the divide with the analog people. It's a real sickness. And I'm hoping there's a reckoning about this, because, you know, what this has done, this COVID-19, in the way of redistribution of wealth, is devastating, and it's embarrassing, and we should all be ashamed of it. But that's what's happened here. And, you know, I'm no socialist, but I am vehemently opposed to the growing amount of the gap between wealth and poverty in America. That is a very, very serious problem.
Indeed. Well, listen, Joshua, there's so much there. And, you know, I really appreciate you joining me in these insights, which are extraordinary. And the book, again, is American Awakening, Identity Politics, and Other Afflictions of Our Time. Joshua, let people know where they can get your excellent book.
Well, they can get it through Encounter Books, which publishes it. They can probably get it at Barnes and Noble as well. And notwithstanding what I've just said, in the way this is the pathology, they can also get it on Amazon.
I know we have that's the one company that's really booming in this whole.
I know. Yep.
All right, exactly. Joshua, listen, I want to thank you very much for joining me. It's been really interesting. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me, Charles. It was great to talk with you.